1, 2, 3.
While our weekly shows are edited to time for broadcasts on public TV and community radio, we offer to our members and podcast subscribers the full uncut conversation. The following is from our episode reporting on policing at the polls and BIPOC voter suppression in 2024, and was recorded on September 17th, 2024. These audio exclusives are made possible thanks to our members' supporters.
We are weeks away from a super important election in a country that is still grappling with its democracy. Just this month, Republican mega donor and South African immigrant Elon Musk amplified a post that seemed to suggest that the whole system would work better if voting was restricted just to high-status men. With attitudes like that still out there, will all who want to vote be able to, especially those who've historically been the most excluded, and whose votes could once again ultimately decide the outcome?
Right, Laura, we're already seeing new restrictive voter ID laws in places like North Carolina and on many reservations, lingering cases of voter intimidation in places like Pennsylvania, and of course, the most growing part of this entire thing, which is the vigilante type election integrity watchdogs that are forming all across the country. Now, what does this all mean for millions of eligible voters of color for whom the stakes of this election are high? But when we talk about the hurdles to even participate in this election, are those even higher?
Well, for this month's Meet the BIPOC Press Roundtable, I am joined, as you can see, by, this time as co-host, Kadia Tubman of the Scripps News Broadcast Network. Hi, Kadia. I'm so glad to have you here.
Hi, Laura. I'm happy to be here.
And we, at our non-existent table, are joined by Chenjerai Kumanyika, who's an NYU journalism professor, as well as the host of the excellent new podcast Empire City, which looks at the origins of the New York police. Also with us, Christopher Lomahquahu, an investigative journalist with the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism, which is inside the Cronkite School at Arizona State University. Welcome all.
Yes, it's great to have you both with us. I want to start off with the word safe. Whenever I report on or hear about election integrity or election security, these phrases that keep popping up, the phrase safe and secure seems to tag along and show its head. It's almost like it's replacing the term free and fair elections. And both of your work has in some shape or form touched on safety or what it means to be safe and who gets to be safe. But Christopher, I want to start with you and your recent article where you lay out the barriers to voting and access to voting for many Indigenous voters. I want to talk to you about what does safety look like, and are elections safe right now for Indigenous voters?
Well, I think when we look in terms of the actual environment on the ground, it is a bit more safer, I believe, in terms of having that access to voting and the polls that are located nearby and in some cases within their communities. In terms of the word safe from potentially being impacted, like by the word of law or legislation that is passed, it still has a ways to go. And recently, with the story that we ran up with the Western Native Voice and their which is a nonprofit voter advocacy group in Montana, they had just recently talked about their what basically was the case that they won along with other parties back in March, and now they're finding that the Secretary of State for Montana is actually appealing that case, which would have basically eliminated same-day voter registration or third-party ballot. So when that was overturned, it was assumed that that was preserved, that people could vote on the as far as register the same day and have their ballots collected. Now that's being appealed, and it seems like, okay, now they have to anticipate another court case in order to defend those rights. So when you look at saved, it still seems like those voter rights are still not safe from the actual legislation that would create barriers to their basically their accessibility to vote.
Talking about, we're talking about physical barriers. I just want you to make that clear when you talk about when we're removing third-party collection and we're making it impossible for same-day voting. What does that look like, Christopher, on the ground in many of these places like Montana or Nebraska or Alaska?
I can speak to Montana and places like Nevada, which also I went and reported at, and speaking with people also in North Dakota as well, in that area, in those regions. it's very rural area. That's the one barrier is physically going to one distance, which could be as much as 50 to 100 miles both ways. And that really creates a barrier to voting on top of the laws that have been trying to be passed to create this barrier in terms of like, okay, for somebody who may not have a car, they may have to rely on other people within their community, within their town to go either submit their vote or go physically vote in person to cast their ballot. And so, in terms of like that has been posed a challenge before.
It goes to the question of history. And Chenjerai, you talk a lot about if we don't know the history, we don't know the facts. What are we missing in our media discussion of this whole question of voting rights and voting security?
Well, I think one thing that's important is to understand that, voter disenfranchisement has been so consistent that we might as well go ahead and call it like a principle of American so-called democracy. Even in the Constitutional Convention, we know that there were efforts to make sure that not everyone can vote. The way that the Senate in particular is structured is such that it is kind of a little bit anti-democratic, and that particular kind of government structure really is a little bit like you don't see that necessarily around the world in quite the same way, where states are given a kind of equality that's deeply anti-democratic. And then the efforts to disenfranchise people, I mean, all the way back to in our show, we'll talk about my show Empire City, but one of the things that you see is that one of the things why Black communities are being targeted in New York all the way back in like even, the 1850s is because if people have property, they can vote. So, this goes back. And so it's not a new thing. And it's a space of innovation where folks continue to innovate new ways. And I think that once we understand that, these claims about voter ID or whatever ridiculous framing devices will appear as distractions and actually part of a kind of propaganda campaign and a long history of disenfranchising people.
Well, picking up on that, Chenjerai, I mean, Kadia and I were actually talking about this as we thought about today's program, in the sense that, there's a lot of people out there saying, this election, the amount of political violence, the tension, the division is really showing the cracks in our democracy. And I listen to you and research as I do, and you wonder, are these cracks in our system or fissures that were intentionally built in? And then the question is, well, as media, how do we respond to that? Because there is a threat, as Kadia pointed out in our conversation, that emphasizing how long-standing and historical, embedded these obstacles are, we just discourage people, especially all-important minority voters, from participating at all.
Absolutely. Well, I think one thing that's really important is that media can do is to paint why it's important for people to vote, but to do so, without buying into these tropes of like, we're losing democracy. I mean, I think what history teaches us is that America has been, put like this, marginalized and oppressed groups in America have been trying to push it toward being a democracy, but it has never achieved any kind of robust democracy. But we do want to try to protect what people have fought for. And I think that media can really be clear about all the spaces where that needs to happen, what the specific obstacles are. And I think that's important because even in spaces where people are inclined to resist, inclined to protest and try to protect people's voting rights, sometimes people lose morale. There's a sense of feeling like it's just too much. And maybe this is all the same. And really, we have to fight this battle again. So the kind of work that Chris is doing, really identifying, here's what's going down, and here's what you can do, and here's what people are doing is absolutely crucial. And I think that's much better than playing into these tropes of like that where we imagine like, that somehow before Donald Trump, America was this robust democracy.
That's what at least what I'm hearing when I talk to folks about disinformation and misinformation. The tactic isn't necessarily about confusing people. It's about making it so chaotic that people say, well, this is hopeless, or this is so big and so problematic that I can't possibly change that. I have a sense, Christopher, that in even reading your work and going through what Indigenous communities are battling against, when they're coming up against barriers to voting. It sounds like that is also happening in the case of, well, look at the 100 years that we had to go to just to fight to vote, or even when we were granted the ability to vote, we were still stopped in so many ways. How is that translating in Indigenous communities that are probably going to move a lot of different states right now?
Yes, I think it speaks to the resiliency of Native people. Like you mentioned, it wasn't until 100 years ago that Native Americans were granted citizenships of this country. And throughout that time, there was, as part of that, that was the right to vote. But as was mentioned, there have always been barriers. There's been things that were put in the way to say that Native people, they could not understand or read English or really know what they were voting for. But in full fact, like you're looking at it, they understood what was the landscape of the environment they were living in, both politically, physically, and of course everything else that they were impacted by. And with these groups that you're seeing out here with the Western Native Voice, Arizona Native Vote, other organizations that you're finding across these different states, is that they understand that history, but it hasn't deterred them from looking ahead as far as like what they can do to activate those other voters, especially the youth who are going to be that next generation. Because in indigenous cultures, we're always looking at those next generation of Native people. What are they going to do? How are they going to face this new environment that we're in? And I think that they find really innovative ways and not give up. And then, like I said, with these cases, it's basically like a wave after wave. Is like they've been finding themselves in the courts with the state trying to reverse a lot of these decisions that are being made. And then so, through that 100 years, it just shows how we've been able to not back down, but step up and be able to face the challenges that are in our way, and then try to basically open the door so that other people can have the opportunity to vote. Because when you look at some of these laws that are border on voter suppression, you see they don't just impact indigenous communities; they impact a lot of people from low income communities, people where there's not a lot of infrastructure, and just basically a lot of, as far as individuals that may not have a seat at the table. So I think that really shows that we're trying to keep that seat and then open that avenue for other people to be there as well.
We should point out that Native people vote more than anybody else. I mean, indigenous voters vote in
Wow.
tribal elections as well as U.S. elections, right? I mean, are Democrats in particular, who relied so much on Native voters in Nevada and Arizona to elect both the presidency and senators last time around, giving those Native vote organizations you mentioned, Christopher, the kind of support they need right now, do you think?
Well, they work independently of state and other entities out there. So I believe that, a lot of them are just self-supported. They're supported by volunteers, people who give their time to go out and canvass communities and talk to people and do voter registration drives, things like that. I haven't really seen too much interaction between people that are running for office or anything here in Arizona, and directly in participation with a group in particular, but they do acknowledge, like, as far as like with the Secretary of State, Adrian Fontes, and other individuals, they acknowledge that indigenous voters do make up a good voting block of either their district or even across the state. So they understand, they acknowledge that, but I think there is room for more engagement to talk about how what their platforms or whatever they are running for are able to address and meet the needs of these indigenous communities. And of course, we have a large Hispanic population, which is, by far very large here in the Phoenix metropolitan area. And so, there's a lot of groups that are being, trying to gain that, as far as that collaboration, so that their needs are not falling through the cracks.
What Laura at the top of this was talking about, a certain person, I don't like to say his name, a certain person who made it clear that there should be certain types of people voting. And that has been historically around for the longest. Chenjerai, I want to come to you at this point. I'm thinking about Empire City, about your podcast, the brilliant podcast that takes us through the actual true history of the NYPD. But there's a particular part of the series, and everyone should watch it or listen to it, that I particularly am stuck with. It's about the publisher, the founder, writer of the New York Herald, and how at a point, this is before the abolition of slavery, when New York was participating in returning enslaved people back to the South. He wrote about, the publisher wrote about Black resistance, about how ultimately he was seeing the pushback from Black New Yorkers against enslaved people being sent back as linking to them having political power or wanting the right to vote. And so ultimately, he said, quote, that the city would be controlled by a violent, ignorant mob, that the idea of having Black enslaved people or formerly enslaved people or Black Americans ultimately voting would change who gets to vote and who gets to be in power. I want to also connect that to 2008, the general election, where they were in Michigan, there was a secret plan to challenge the votes of people who had homes that were foreclosed. And the idea was that if you went after these people, that you would particularly going after minorities and poor people. So this has been around. How have you seen the intertwining of power, politics, and police come forth in this time? And how do you link it to, that was over about 100, not even 100, 200 years ago, not even 200 years ago. How do you link that?
Absolutely. Well, that moment where James Gordon Bennett is writing about, the George Kirk case, and this is a case everyone should try to understand because it was one of the first major deployment. It's basically the first major deployment of police in New York. It happens a year after the modern NYPD is founded, and they send 900 officers to kidnap one fugitive. And I was amazing to see that his commentary, James Gordon Bennett, the founder of the Herald, his commentary on that was about voting rights. Like he was saying, this Black resistance, these efforts that Black folks are making to keep their community safe, we should look at that in terms of their political power and voting rights. So I think there's a couple of things that you see there. And I think that really, one thing I'm seeing, and, when we look around really the country, what we see now, the fight for democracy is happening in places all over the country, on issues related to voting, on issues related to climate change, certainly on issues related to immigration, which really is a lens through which we can almost see every other issue in this election. And police are kind of on the wrong side of all those battles. So I think that, if you look back then, one very concrete element of this is that police are involved in charging people and sort of they involve them in the carceral system. And then once you're in the carceral system, this compromises your voting rights. But often the reasons why people end up in the carceral system are ridiculous. Recently in New York, we just saw someone named Darrell Mickelson, who was targeted by the NYPD because he allegedly did not pay a $2.90 fare. And the NYPD wound up shooting 4 people as a result of that. Now, I'm not sure at this status what how he's doing. I'm not sure if he's dead. I think he might be, but if he's alive, because of these charges, what will his voting rights status be? It's like so. So these are ways in which policing has always been involved. And of course, I just want to say that many people will be familiar with the history during the long arc of Jim Crow, in which if voting was not legal, police were part of the apparatus that would stop Black people to vote. And of course, trying to gain those rights was a big part of what pushes the civil rights movement. So yeah, it's I think we need to talk about, so far, so much of this discussions of policing have been around incidents of police brutality or assault. And part of what Empire City is trying to do is to shift the terrain into these politics of policing, how policing is really involved in fighting democracy in a way.
Well, let me pick up on that, Chenjerai. And in fact, Christopher, too, I'd love you to weigh in. Insofar as this feature of the show focuses on journalism and media, what's your advice for journalists as they try to cover elections? Because as you just said, often our police brutality beat is on a different page from our election beat, which is on a certainly different page from our indigenous issues beat, if there even is one. Starting with you, Chenjerai.
Well, the one thing I really want to say about this is this. We have a tendency in the media, and I'm going to say we, but it's probably not the people in this call, to talk about policy as though it's coming out of the intention or goodwill of the candidate. So we talk about what Kamala Harris and Waltz are going to do, what they want to do. And there's a way in which we individualize it. When in fact, these decisions are not actually simply the product of their own individual intention, of their ethics. These are massive political systems. And I think one reason why that is a problem is that for people who can see that, who are not persuaded, for example, by the idea that Kamala Harris is tirelessly working for a ceasefire, which is, of course, absurd, given that even I think this week there was some material support being given to Israel's war on Gaza. When you talk about it as people, as opposed to the way that Chris just put it, Chris said he wants to think of, for younger generations, what is the new environment? What is the new political terrain that might be the case, under one candidate or another? So I think there's a way in which I trust people who are consuming the media I make, and I think we have to be smart enough to say this isn't the kind of government system where a politician just of their own will can just make everything happen. We're talking about complex systems. We're talking about terrains of struggle. And I think that if you really want to hold on to some of these voters who are losing morale, and potential voters, you gotta talk in reality, about how things are going down. So I think that's really important.
Christopher, when you add to anything to that?
Yeah, I think you made a really good point, talking in reality, like, for indigenous communities, and I'm pretty sure there's others out there that, when you're talking about the issues, they're not talking about issues that are far off, like 100 miles away or somewhere across the country, like a place like DC or anything. They're talking about things that are right there in their own community and their reservations and things that happen within their state, because that's really where the big impact is. And that's why with these groups and others advocacy voter groups out there, they're trying to educate, especially targeting the young, as far as the generation is like, okay, how could you look at voting in your community? What are the things that impact you? Is it education? Is it safety? Is it something that you think matters to you that you see when you step out that door? So I think that's like, there's definitely a difference between like what communities see on the local and in terms of the bigger scale and how those impact them. Now to say like, okay, as far as like how we effectively go out there and cover it, I think those are sort of the questions that really need to be asked when we start really looking into why issues persist, not just on voting, but on other issues in terms of culture, preservation, education, the whole gamut of what happens in reservations. You see, like, when we went out to places, they told us like, well, yeah, some journalists would come in there, but they would ask us specific questions, and those questions didn't really exist in our
Mm.
community, but they asked anyways. And so it's like, okay, so they want to make sure that people are really doing the research, really understanding that reservations aren't always the same. Sometimes some have little to no issues with voting. Some have big issues, both physically, politically, on that spectrum. So I think that really having this real well-rounded idea of like what indigenous communities go through, and you could really, as far as like really shape and understand and build the connections with those people, because those people see you as not, okay, we're not editorializing the questions. We're not trying to just give them, okay, we're looking for that kind of spring-loaded one. We're looking at things that, well, what matters to you, may not be, as far as what happens across the country, but okay, what is it that needs to be done that really is affecting you every day as you go about, your lives in these reservations. So it's really about trying to just focus on the local part. Of course, it's always going to be, the bigger impact is going to obviously impact how communities are treated, whoever the next president will be. They are concerned with that too as well. So that's not just far from the picture, but it is something that obviously will eventually, have a place in terms of their peripheral of what, okay, immediately impacts their lives.
Because it's going to be the down to earth issues that really impact them. In reading about many of the different communities of color and reporting on these communities of color about around voting, especially around disinformation and misinformation, a lot of the times local issues come up as one of the key reasons or key ways that local advocates are able to actually get people riled up to go and participate, even to go and register to vote. I'm thinking, Christopher, about a 2020 report from the Native American Right Fund that found that more than 1.5 million eligible Native American voters were not registered. And one of the looming questions that a lot of folks have around the Native American vote in 2024 is not who they will vote for at the end of the day, but if they will show up to vote at all. How are you facing that question, especially like you said, when it comes to younger Native American voters who may not even show up to the polls?
Yeah, that always is like the big question trying to find that solid answer or answer that is tracking in that right direction. Because there is a thing, how are we going to look at who shows up, when you talk to the different individuals within these communities, the older generation, they get it. They understand why voting is important. Some of them served in the armed forces when they weren't considered citizens of this country, actually, let me take that back. They served in armed forces when they didn't have the right to vote. they were citizens at that time, but they could not cast their vote. And there's some that just grew up throughout the different, periods of social and issue, and obviously the civil rights movements that were going on across the country throughout the mid part of the 20th century. For this generation, as far as like having them show up, is kind of goes back to what impacts you, what is it important to you. And I think what really the groups that are out there, they're really trying to hit at bringing their voice, because you feel like, okay, as a youth coming from a tribal community, you're sort of not, you feel like you're not heard. But I think when these groups go out there, they really try to activate them, get their voice, get them involved in the idea of what democracy is, what is their idea of what democracy means to them. And I think that's really how they're trying to get the younger voters to the polls. And, not just people that are at voting age, but also people that are even, 10, 20 years older too, as well. So I think that's going to be a big thing that every community tries to tackle, is like how we're going to get as many people voted. And then it comes down to some of the simplest things, having an event, having something around food and culture and entertainment, things like that, something that resonates with them. Those are the things that you see that really helping bring together people, as far as like as far as to have this dialogue about voting, and as far as having the youth involved. And you see that happen in other areas too, where you're having youth across the country be involved in these democracy camps, things that are going on within their either school, local groups, to try to have them formulate, well, what are the ideas? What are the things that you see in terms of like your community? And then how does that really translate to the broader, bigger picture of how youth play a role in today's landscape?
One thing I think what Chris is saying is so important. And, building on that, I would say how you talk to people who are skeptical of what it means to vote is really important. I mean, oftentimes from media, from people maybe who are a little bit more experienced in political or electoral organizing, there's a kind of shaming, right? Like, well, voting is important, people died for this, etc. And I think what the media have to do, finger wagging, it's like, what the media have to do, I think, and what people in the position who want to do this have to do two things, right? One thing is you have to acknowledge that people's skepticism about American democracy is justified, right? And that the things that politicians may be saying and a lot of the narrative they're going to hear are if they get the sense that maybe this is kind of like BS, it's like that's essentially, there's a lot of evidence that, for that it is. And then to say, but nevertheless, your voice and your vote matters, and especially on the local level, because what happens, who gets put into power is going to change the landscape. And I think the ability to have those kind of conversations and to have the kind of, bottom up process, there's also a political economic aspect to that. And what I mean by that is some of the nonprofit money that's coming, that sort of flows throughout these political parties to get out the vote. Sometimes they go in certain communities and it's happening very early in the election cycle, right? They're like, there's a certain kind of money that's like, talk to people, hear from them what's important, and let that influence the agenda. But then other communities, more marginalized communities, that money is then going, it's more like last minute money, right? Where it's just like, go to the door and then try to shame people into voting or whatever, have a brief conversation. So I think we have to have those interventions too. But I do think that the tone and the way you talk to people, especially at this moment where the contradictions of American empire are on such, sharp display, you got to hear people if you want to pull them in. And I think you can, though. That's the thing, is when you listen to people, when you make them feel like their voice matters, I think it does affect their engagement.
Laura Flanders and Friends asks the questions we need to be asking to move forward. While the commercial media is centered on what sells advertising, which is too often fear, we're centered on change makers, imagining a better world and creating the solutions to get us there. That's thanks to the generous support of viewers and listeners like you. While we are independent media, we do depend on you. Please contribute by making a one-time donation or make it monthly. Go to lauraflanders.org/donate. As Angela Davis says, when vast numbers of people come together, this is how change happens. Please come together with us now. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your continued support. Now back to our conversation.
diversity is so important, especially in our media. Now, it's not a destination, but it is important because speaking to this white person here, it's like white Americans have mostly been given this image of our democracy as a kind of additive project. If we can just secure rights for the mainstream, so-called, then rights will kind of trickle down. We'll add things on. And what I'm hearing every election season that I've been here ever has been actually are those fissures in our democracy, excluding critical people, that scuttle the whole process, that weaken the whole machine. So I guess my question to both of you and Kadia is, are things changing? For example, the work that you're doing, Chenjerai, to show this story of history, is it shifting people's sort of trickle-down approach to justice, rights, democracy, you name it?
I think it is. I mean, I'm hopeful that it is. We're getting a really exciting feedback on Empire City. When you're doing a sort of dense, what could be considered like a weedsy history, you're concerned that maybe it's going to be boring and you don't want to sort of put people to sleep. But I'm getting a lot of good feedback, and I think part of that was we tried to tell a story that was also a story of resistance. And, it was interesting, if you talk about some of the major media outlets, some of whom are outlets that I've worked with, this project was produced by Crooked Media, and we had Wondery. I mean, these are big companies. But even if you look at a company like the New York Times, or as some people call it, the New York War Crimes, what I think is important to sort of say here is that these are contested spaces. So I think we should absolutely be critical of these institutions, but we also have to remember that there's people in them who want to tell a different story, people who have come up watching Laura Flanders and Friends and Democracy Now! And so many other things. And they want to use that media to do things differently. And so I think that that's one thing that has changed in the environment. I also think that, we are coming out of a phase that is like sort of the end of what could be called like a Black Lives Matter decade, bracketing, whatever the problems with the Black Lives Matter organization have been. But, people have lived through these uprisings. Folks now have seen, all these cycles play out. And so they're bringing a lot of that, savvy to political organizing. And so it's different. And I think a lot more of a critical sense of what America is really about. So I do think we're moving forward, and I'm inspired by the leadership. I'm inspired by the kind of work that Chris is talking about, the kind of work that we see on, all the time from the journalists on this show. And I think we have to kind of call attention to that without exaggerating the kind of victory that it is. We do have to lift those up because morale is absolutely essential.
I agree. I am hopeful, especially as someone who's mostly covering this information. I don't think I could be hopeful, but I am. One thing I've noticed in particular, especially in terms of what media folks are doing, is that they're paying less attention to the nonsense. It may not seem like that when you turn on the TV, and I think TV is a different world. But when you actually are online and you're seeing actual reporting come out, reporting like Chris is reporting, podcasts like Chenjerai's podcast, you can actually see that there's less nonsense, or the nonsense is being combated with at the same time with the good information. And a lot of the times when I talk to different communities about where do they get their information from, how do they trust the media that they're tapping into, a lot of it is them saying, I trust the voices in my community the most. And so now that we're seeing more and more voices in the community come up, and it doesn't have to necessarily be through traditional media, it doesn't have to be through the New York Times or the Guardian or etc. It can be as simple as someone a former reporter that I follow on TikTok who's like, I don't work for a news organization, but I'm going to tell people in my community, mostly Black people, what's happening in the news. And so I feel like there's a lot of hope, but there is a lot of change. But right now, what's most important in terms of what the media can do is constantly put up, and again, not traditional media, but constantly put up good information to combat, or at least shout all the bad stuff that we're hearing and that's constantly out there.
Christopher, you want to come in on this same
Yeah,
question?
I think, just kind of following along, like in the same vein is that, you see a lot of progress coming up in terms of the diversity in the newsrooms, people, editors, people wanting to kind of, especially individuals like myself and others who, they want to hear, well, what's your take on this? What are your experiences in this? And what can you share that can help us understand why this story is newsworthy? Of course, the newsworthiness isn't like, as Mitch is not in, a big newspaper, is not in a big publication, but it's actually what happens to community members, people that are dealing with everyday things that happen to them. And I think that's really the thing that I'm seeing a lot is a lot of that more extra time to really listen, stop, and understand, okay, it's not just simply about the story, it's about the different layers to that, the cultural component, the social component, everything, the stigmas, how do we get by those stigmas without having to feel like we're parachuting in and just kind of collecting the information we want and then leaving. So I think that's what really tribal communities really like is like when people really get to know them, really get to understand their struggles and what they're going through and also what their successes are because there is a lot of success in indigenous communities and I think those really do need to be highlighted a bit more in terms of like what progress has been made, how are they holding the government accountable for things that they should be doing as has stated way and as far as what the government the treaty agreements that each tribe has. So those are really important things that I know that communities and us as journalists we could really focus on and I know we probably have done that in our own as far as the areas that we work in thinking, okay, so what is it that really is the part of like where they get their news is at? Where is it that they actually trust where the news comes from? And so when they see somebody, that kind of sort of has a similar background or similar upbringing, and not necessarily that has to be the criteria, but it just certainly reassures that there's people listening. And so when you start seeing newsrooms really kind of listen to that and really kind of understand that piece that you obviously bring to the environment, it really opens the door to potentially other types of stories you'd be covering because there's plenty of other things that are out there that are other aside from voting. We have the missing and murdered indigenous peoples or women's movement that's as far as like as happening and there's just kind of obviously other things that we can be focusing on as well. So I think it's really moving in that direction where we can really try to, as far as people cover and canvas a lot of these issues.
I don't want to suggest that there's a happy ending to your Empire City, and I haven't gotten there yet in the podcast. But you did say at the beginning, kind of like Christopher just did, that ours is a story of incremental progress and retrenchment, progress and backlash. But are there stories you'd like to lift up from the struggles you've been reporting on Chenjerai that you think might be inspiring, encouraging, illuminating on this front?
Well, I think that, we're getting so much excitement about this show currently, and so in the charts, we're like #1 in the history category on Apple's charts, for example. So that's great. I mean, there's a lot of shows in that. And I think one reason, again, is that we lift up those moments of resistance. What I think we have to do in our movements is find a way to be in the world where we're committed to a sense of constant pushing forward. Constant struggle might sound too much for people, but constant pushing forward. And that's what people in the 19th century had to do. So they have so many examples. I mean, whether it is like moments where they were able to, make sure that someone did not get sent back into slavery, whether it was, a Black woman who was thrown off of a streetcar and wound up suing the whole city successfully, whether it's moments of, Muslim people in New York who were able to, push back against the way that they had been surveilled. I mean, there's so many moments where you can see that victories were won, and it did matter that people fought, and they were able to take the morale from that victory, although it was not permanent, and push to the next level. And I think that, but once you decenter police from the conversation about safety, right? In other words, what I mean is, obviously, this is a show that focuses on the history of the NYPD. But once you sort of dispense historically with the myth that the NYPD was created to keep most of us safe, right? Then you can say, well, what did people do to keep each other safe? And you can access all the power and even the joy and pain and sort of lessons on how people keep themselves safe when they're clear that the carceral system isn't going to do that.
And then I'm thinking about the safety, when we think about safety and democracy, and how right now it seems like safety and making sure that everyone can vote is just like an inverse relationship. I mean, we even had the former president saying to the police agency, basically saying, "Hey, we need more police involved. We need you to watch out because we would win so much easily if you guys are involved." And quote, I think he says specifically, "You do not know how afraid people are of the badge." So when we think about democracy,
speaking to that fraternal order of police, right, seeking their endorsement, which he then got
in North Carolina. So all of it is absolutely connected.
That's wow. That's really disturbing. And I just also want to just I just want to stress, you also see immigration, how this strain of using immigrants as a way to inspire fear, but also offering to those immigrants like this mechanism, like you can become police, you can become part of the apparatus of even keeping your own people out. That goes also all the way back even to the beginning of the department. One thing I was amazed to find, in the NYPD is very much identified with Irish, people right now, to the point where you would assume that that was always the case. But the very first police force in New York, it was like Irish need not apply, and so those strains go back. So in that way too, the history of the NYPD is actually, while being divisive because some people support police, it's actually a unifier in the worst way, in the sense that there are so many diverse groups of people who were targeted by the NYPD, from Russian Jews to German immigrants to Black Americans to Latinos to Chinese American. I mean, it's like all these folks, there's this tremendous archive of people who were kind of on the wrong end of the NYPD's guns. And, and I think that archive needs to be recognized.
And Laura, to your point that you once made before we started talking, was about how in some countries it's simple to vote, that it shouldn't be so hard. But in this country, if it is simple to vote, it is considered that our elections aren't safe. So there's an inverse between safety and simple, when it should be that everyone should be able to vote. To Christopher's point about young people, hey, when they turn 18, maybe they get a ballot card in the mail. Maybe it should be that easy that you shouldn't have to fight. Or, as Chenjerai said, you don't have to push forward because no one wants to constantly be fighting. But yes, there's a constant struggle in a way. There's a constant push for progress. And I just wanted to make that connection in terms of when we think of safety and our election and who gets to be safe and who's kept out and why.
Can I ask you all a quick question? One thing, and I'm sorry, and Chris, you may have some insight on this because you bring experience with a different kind of democracy. One thing I think that we really need right now is robust accounts of what it takes to actually build different kinds of parties, right? Because, I think that clearly we have a two-party system here in the US. It's one of the reasons so many people are alienated, because they know. And, you realize how rare that is. You go to other countries, they're like all these parties, right? And so, it seems like a lot of people don't understand, I think there's inordinate pressure on the Green Party, for example, to be the alternative party because you just don't have enough. And the Green Party doesn't seem to be a model that a lot of people can connect to in terms of what it means to actually build a party that actually matters and can exert leverage. Whatever people like about the Green Party, and I'm not here to diss it. I'm just saying that, like, it's unclear that people understand, like, party building is not something where you get out and announce your views and then in like 2 years, you're on every ballot, et cetera. And, it's like, this takes time. So I just wonder if you all have accounts of that, if you're aware of good media coverage of that. Party building. We probably may have to even go outside the United States to do that, because I think that if people can understand what it takes to build alternative parties and where we might be in that process now, that could also get a lot of people engaged. The Working Families Party has one model of it that I think is compelling, but just one.
We've done a few interviews with Mo Mitchell from the Working Families Party over the years. People can check that out in our archives. But Chris, I would love to hear your response to that and hear a little from you with your perspective on how governance models can be different.
Yeah, well, I think that's like a really good idea as far as like topic to discuss about parties and because obviously for places like here in Arizona, we sort of look at it. I mean, as just every other place is like there's a Republican Democratic Party. And we sort of don't, as far as we only see it in those ways, in terms of like, okay, which side do we choose? But in terms of that's like actually new territory. That would be something interesting to kind of look at how parties could be built based on what the communities, what the people, as far as what they can relate to, because for indigenous communities, it can be hard to try to relate to one side. Communities from tribal communities are very diverse. You can have some with very interesting views on different things and some that are very opening and very understanding of like what's going on. So, and that can be all in one place. So I think that's really kind of interesting to try to hear that, as far as like how a party could be built, because there's a lot of diversity in communities such as myself and others that are out there across the country. and what they view as like as far as like represents them. Because I think there is that stigma to get by is that, well, these parties, regardless of what side they are, they represent the interests of government, but how can you do that so that it represents the interests of the people? And I think that's like the biggest thing that could be helpful in indigenous communities to know how they could basically create these spaces for them to take part in, and that they shouldn't just happily just think of it as two-party system or a third one if there's one as far as that you choose to be a part of. So I think that's really important because you do see that there's a lot of differences in how in terms of how they view themselves fitting in these parties. Some people just figure you grow up, you learn voting, and then if you fall within those values or those, as far as ideas, then that's who your party was going to be, and you voted for them.
Christopher, I'm excited for any work that you're coming out with next because I'm assured it's going to be good, especially as we get closer and closer to November. What are you working on right now that we should be keeping an eye out on?
Particularly right now, so we're an investigative journalist. So right now in the Howard Center, we're working on some projects, but due to nature to them, they're obviously kept pretty close. But the nature of like why we do this, what the work we do is because it does shed light on things that normally people sort of dismiss or they take for granted or they don't question enough. And it sort of just provides as far as an avenue for people to really think about it. If they look around their city or their town or their community, it kind of gives them that idea, the extra lens of like, okay, what's happening that's impacting. So there are some stuff that'll be coming out. So hopefully, as that story that we're working on progresses, we're going to have that made available by at least maybe next year or sometime shortly after the new year.
Chenjerai, same question for you. I'm dying to get back onto the podcast. I'm imagining you're out there promoting it, but what's on your horizon?
Well, I think, one thing right now is that we're finishing up the series. We probably have a couple of bonus episodes we'll finish. And the first task was to get the historical work out there and to do it in a compelling way. But I've also been working with an organization called Perspective Fund and others to have a kind of impact campaign where we're going to try to see how can we use this material to do some work with impacted folks, with the people who are on the ground. And so I encourage people who may have ideas for that to reach out because what I if this just sits on a podcast feed, it hasn't done what it really needs to do. This meeting needs to become part of curriculums. We'd like to see it become part of the work. And so, yeah, that's kind of what's next on the horizon. And I'm really excited about that part.
And I can only imagine, Kadia, that you are swamped over there at Scripps reporting on misinformation and targeted misinformation. But I hope you have time to come back with me again. It's really been a joy having you co-host today.
Been fantastic. And thank you to both of our awesome panelists.
And let's not forget, while we're talking about history, am I right in saying, Christopher, isn't it true that our whole democracy in this country is sort of modeled on the Iroquois Confederacy? Aren't you all to blame?
I can't speak for the Iroquois, but I mean, I know, yeah, it has its foundations in that. But I know with that, there is opportunities to obviously create new avenues of democracy in across, that could be followed elsewhere,
I hear you. All right. Thank you all. It's been great having you with us. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Great to be here.
It's been a pleasure. I'm glad to be on this panel.
Thank you so much. This was great.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this full uncut conversation from our Meet the BIPOC Press monthly series. These audio exclusives are made possible thanks to our member supporters. Please join our members now by making a one-time donation at lauraflanders.org/donate. Or make it monthly. Go to patreon.com/Laura Flanders and Friends. That's also where you'll find more information on this conversation in the episode notes posted. That's patreon.com/Laura Flanders and Friends. And thanks again to all our member supporters.